Hey, you. You're finally awake.
By the early 90s, the NES was on its last legs. With the Super Nintendo dominating the spotlight and its 16-bit graphics dazzling players across the globe, most gamers had already moved on from the aging bit hardware. But despite its fading popularity, the NES wasn't quite ready to ride off into the sunset. In fact, the console's final years saw a surprising wave of releases, many of them ambitious, experimental, and occasionally bizarre. These late-era titles were often overshadowed by flashier SNES counterparts, or quickly slipped into store shelves with little fanfare. Yet for those who stuck around, the NES had a few tricks up left in its sleeve. So today we're going to be looking at 7 games that were released at the end of the NES lifecycle. As always, before we get into the list, if you do like this video, please leave it a like and subscribe if you think I deserve it. It really helps the channel grow. We've also got a weekly podcast where this week we're covering Sonic Rush for the Nintendo DS, and we also have a $1 a month Patreon where you can join the Smut Squad, get involved in the podcast, and also get your own additional show. Right, let's get into it, shall we? 7 late-era NES games. Wario Woods. Wario Woods holds a unique distinction in Nintendo's 8-bit legacy. It was the final officially licensed game released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, launching in December 1994. While the SNES had long since become Nintendo's primary platform, Wario Woods served as a swan song for the NES, and it was anything but a half-hearted effort. Developed by Nintendo R&D1 Intelligent Systems, this puzzler blended familiar mechanics with some refreshing new ideas. It starred not Mario nor Luigi, but rather Toad, making the one time he has served as the sole protagonist in a game. And despite being overshadowed by more prominent puzzle titles like Tetris or Dr. Mario, Wario Woods is a clever and often underappreciated title with a quirky charm of its own. The story is delightfully whimsical. The peaceful woods have been invaded by Wario, who has corrupted the once harmonious forest by summoning an army of monsters. In typical Nintendo fashion, it's up to cheerful underdog, in this case Toad, to clear out the infestation and restore order. Toad is supported by a benevolent sprite named Wanda and faces off against Wario himself, who pops in periodically to taunt the player or make things more difficult. While simple is the narrative, it's full of charm and maintains a Saturday morning cartoon feel that fits the game's vibrant personality. Gameplay-wise, Wario Woods is a falling object puzzle game at its core, but with a unique twist. Unlike most puzzlers where the player manipulates blocks from above, here you control Toad directly as he runs around inside the well. He physically picks up and rearranges bombs and monsters, stacking them in vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines or 3 or more to make them disappear. The twist adds an element of real-time strategy and physicality not often seen in the genre. As levels progress, the game gets faster and more chaotic, especially when Wario enters the fray to replace helpful Wanda and increase the pressure. The controls take some getting used to. Toad can pick up and carry large stacks of objects, kick them, throw them, or even climb them. It's surprisingly complex for an NES game, and initially it can feel clumsy. However, with practice it becomes more intuitive, and the depth of the system starts to shine. The ability to physically maneuver pieces instead of rotating or dropping them opens up new strategic possibilities not found in typical match-based puzzlers. Graphically, Wario's Woods is quite impressive for a late NES title. The sprites are colourful, detailed, and full of personality. Toad's animations are expressive, and Wario's manic energy bursts from the screen every time he appears. The backgrounds are simple but effective, and the monster designs range from cute to bizarre. For a system that was nearly a decade old at the time, Wario Woods squeezes out a surprising amount of visual flair. Musically, the game is upbeat and cheerful, fitting the aesthetic quite well. Each mode and its stage has its own catchy tune, and the sound effects, especially Toad's exaggerated grunt when listing objects, add to the game's cartoony atmosphere. The audio presentation may not be legendary, but it's well executed and adds to its overall charm. Reception was mixed at launch. Critics praised the originality and depth, but some found the controls unwieldy and gameplay too frantic. It didn't help that by 1994, the NES audience had shrunk significantly. However, the game did find a new life later through re-releases on the Wii and the 3DS Virtual Console and inclusion in Nintendo Switch Online. Today it's seen as an odd but intriguing entry in the puzzle genre. Ultimately, Wario Woods is a fascinating piece of Nintendo's history. It's mechanically ambitious, packed with personality, and brimming with the kind of offbeat creativity that defines many of Nintendo's cult classics. While it may not reach the heights of Tetris or Dr. Mario, it deserves recognition as a worthy send-off for the NES and a hidden gem in the puzzle game landscape. The Incredible Crash Dummies. The Incredible Crash Dummies for the NES is one of those games that was remembered more for its license than its gameplay, and not always in a good way. Released in 1993 and developed by Grey Matter with publishing handled by LJN, the game is based on the popular toy line and PSA-inspired cartoon series of the early 90s. The Crash Dummies brand was originally created to promote car safety awareness, using humanoid crash test dummies like Sick and Spin to educate kids about seatbelts and automobile safety. Somewhere along the way, it became a full-blown multimedia franchise, and of course that meant a video game tie-in was inevitable. Unfortunately, what we got on the NES was a messy, frustrating, and often broken side-scrolling platformer that failed to capitalise on the charm of its source material. While the idea of playing as anthropomorphic crash dummies could have led to some humorous or creative gameplay, the execution is a lot to be desired. The story here is wafer thin. You play as Slick, or sometimes Spin, on a mission to rescue your fellow crash dummies who have been kidnapped by the evil Junkman and his army of rogue machines. It's a basic rescue your friends setup with minimal cutscenes and narrative context. There's an attempt to inject personality throughout the character sprites and a few goofy animations, but it's all very surface level and doesn't do much to enhance the experience. For a game based on a toy line known for slapstick destruction, the story takes itself surprisingly seriously. Graphically, the Incredible Crash Dummies looks serviceable at first glance, but it quickly reveals its limitations. Character sprites are large and fairly detailed, but the dummies' detachable limbs has exaggerated features intact. The backgrounds, however, are repetitive and drab, often consisting of bland industrial environments or uninspired cityscapes. Animation is choppy, and the screen frequently flickers when too many objects are present. Worse yet, the game struggles with slowdown, which can be particularly annoying during precise platforming sequences. The gameplay is where this game is just utter shite. As a platformer, it attempts to combine traditional jump and run mechanics with slapstick physics, but the controls are sluggish and inconsistent. Jumping feels floaty, attacks are awkward, and collision detecting is wildly inaccurate. Enemies often hit you from angles that seem unfair, and hazards like spikes or moving platforms are made worse by the poor responsiveness of the controls. You can lose limbs as you take damage, a concept that would have been clever if they were implemented with more care, but instead it just adds to the frustration, as missing an arm or a leg severely hampers your mobility. The level design here also lacks creativity. Stages are linear, repetitive, and rely too heavily on trial and error. You'll find yourself replaying segments not because they're challenging in a rewarding way, but because the game throws in cheap deaths and poorly telegraphed hazards. Checkpoints are sparse, and the limited number of lives and continues means that casual players likely won't see the end of the game without considerable patience, or a cheat code, or save state, either one you can do. The music is generic and forgettable. It has a peppy, cartoonish vibe that fits the tone of the franchise, but it quickly becomes repetitive. Sound effects fare no better here, with grating beeps and stock thud noises that do little to enhance the action. Compared to other NES games released in the same time frame, the audio design feels particularly underwhelming. Reception at the time of release was tepid at best. Critics noted the novelty of the license, but were quick to point out the poor gameplay, subpar graphics, and frustrating mechanics. The game has since become something of a punchline among retro gamers, often cited as a technical example of how licensed properties were lazily turned into video games in the 90s. In the end, the Incredible Crash Dummies is a squandered opportunity. With a little bit more care, it could have been a quirky physics-based platformer with comedic flair. Instead, it stands as a late-era NES misfire, more of a curiosity than a classic. If you're diving into the NES library, this is one wreck you're better off avoiding. Alfred Chicken. Alfred Chicken is one of the strangest footnotes in the NES library. Released in North America in 1994, this quirky platformer stars a red chicken named Alfred on a surreal journey through bizarre levels filled with balloons, watering cans, and sentient household objects. Developed by Twilight and published by Mindscape, Alfred Chicken was ported to multiple systems including the Game Boy, Amiga, and Super Nintendo, but its NES version is perhaps the most obscure, arriving well after the 16-bit generation had taken the centre stage. Despite its eccentric premise and distinctive visual style, the game suffers from sluggish controls and repetitive level design, making it one of the more of a novelty than a standout NES swansong. The story is absurd as one would expect from a game with a paltry protagonist. Alfred is on a mission to rescue his kidnapped friends from the evil mecha chickens. There's very little narrative context and no real cutscene to develop the plot. I don't give a shit, that's awesome. Mecha chickens! You've got me just with that. But it's clear from the start that logic takes a backseat to pure weirdness. The game's world is more dreamlike than coherent, with everything from living telephones to bouncing spoons trying to kill you. The strangeness is just part of the charm, but it can also feel like randomness for its own sake. At its core, Alfred Chicken is a 2D side-scrolling platform with puzzle elements. Alfred doesn't attack in a traditional sense, he uses a diving beak attack, plunging downwards onto enemies or objects from above. This attack is satisfying when it lands, but it requires awkward timing, especially when trying to hit smaller targets or bounce between platforms. Alfred could also jump and float slowly, but his movements are stiff and imprecise. These physics issues become increasingly frustrating as the game demands more precise platforming in later stages. The game's level design is non-linear in structure. Each stage is more of a maze than a straight path, requiring players to explore, hit switches and pop balloons to progress. While this offers a refreshing break from the standard left-to-right NES platformer formula, the backtracking and vague objectives can be disorientating. There's no in-game map or hint system, and it's easy to get lost or miss key objectives, especially for new players unfamiliar with the game's oddball logic. Visually, Alfred Chicken is a mixed bag. On one hand, the art direction is certainly unique. Enemies and environments are whimsical and abstract with a surreal tone not unlike a child's fever dream. However, the NES version suffers from muted colours, flickering sprites, and minimalist background. It lacks the sharpness and clarity seen in the Game Boy and Super Nintendo iterations, and the limited visual fidelity sometimes makes it difficult to distinguish platforms or enemies. Alfred himself is a bright red chicken sprite with bulging eyes, instantly recognisable but not particularly well animated. The music in Alfred Chicken, though, is catchy but repetitive. Each level loops the same handful of jaunty tunes, which suit the bizarre atmosphere but grow tiresome during long play sessions. Sound effects are sparse, with simple boings, beeps and boops accentuating Alfred's movements and actions. It's serviceable but likely to leave a lasting impression. Critical reception of Alfred Chicken has always been lukewarm. Some praise its weird humour and unconventional structure, while others criticise its sluggish controls, unclear objectives and bland visuals. It's a game that tries to stand out with sheer oddness rather than solid gameplay fundamentals. Its reputation today is one of cult curiosity, a relic from a transitional time in gaming when the NES was fading but still alive enough to host some truly unusual releases. Ultimately, Alfred Chicken is more interesting as a historical oddity rather than a game worth playing. Its surreal tone and strange setting may draw in the curious, but the clunky mechanics and repetitive gameplay quickly wear thin. For NES collectors or fans of eccentric platformers, it might be worth a look, but don't expect a hidden gem. The chicken never quite takes flight. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter on the NES is a strange and surprising entry in both TMNT and fighting game genres. Released by Konami in 1993 during the NES's twilight years, it shares the title and general concept from its Super Nintendo Mega Drive counterparts, but make no mistake, this is a completely different game. While those 16-bit versions offered a more polished Street Fighter II style experience, the NES version is a far more stripped down, limited affair, but one that is nonetheless ambitious for an 8-bit system. It may be rough around the edges, but Tournament Fighter stands out as one of the few pure one-on-one fighting games on the NES, and a rare example of the genre on the console at all. The premise is straightforward. The Turtles enter a martial arts tournament to determine who is the strongest, and to take down the mysterious villain War, who serves as the final boss. This isn't the typical Save April setup, and while the plot is thin, it does introduce a few original characters not commonly seen in the franchise, like the aforementioned War, and originally from the Archie TMNT comics. The story is mainly conveyed through brief static cutscenes and character bios, but for an NES fighting game it tries to give the experience a bit more narrative weight than expected. Gameplay follows a standard 2D fighter format. Two characters face off in a best of 3 match with health bars, special moves and a timer. You can choose from the 4 turtles, Leonardo, Raphael, Donatello, and Michelangelo, and 2 unlockable fighters, Casey Jones and Hothead. Each character has their own unique moveset, and although limited by the NES controller 2-button layout, the game still manages to provide a surprising amount of variety. Special moves are executed through fighting game style inputs, such as quarter circle motions or double taps, and some of them are pretty flashy considering the hardware. One of the game's most infamous quirks is its imbalance. Hothead, a giant dragon-like creature, is absolutely overpowered. His attacks do massive damage and his reach makes him incredibly difficult to counter. In 2-player mode, the game even prevents both players from choosing him, acknowledging how broken he is. This imbalance, while amusing, undermines the competitive integrity of the game and makes solo runs much easier if you can unlock him and use him. Visually, Tournament Fighters is one of the better looking late-era NES games. The character sprites are large and recognisable, with each turtle featuring distinct weapons and stances. The animation is a bit stiff, but given the NES's limitations, Konami did an admirable job making the fighters expressive and the action readable. The backgrounds are colourful and varied, with settings like rooftops, sewers and dojos providing some nice visual diversity. While there are occasional flicker and slowdown, it's relatively controlled compared to many late-gen NES titles. The sound design here is energetic, if somewhat repetitive. Each stage has its own music, with fast-paced chip tunes that match the intensity of the battles. The sound effects are crunchy and satisfying, and punches and kicks land with meaty thuds, and special moves have distinct audio cues. The NES wasn't known for its fighting game soundscapes, but Tournament Fighters does a decent job giving its limitations. Reception at the time was mixed. Critics acknowledged that it was impressive to see a one-on-one fighting game of this scope on the NES, but the sluggish controls, limited roster, and character imbalance were frequent complaints. Modern retrospectives tend to leave it as a curious relic, praised for its ambition but lacking the depth and polish of its 16-bit siblings. Ultimately, TMNT Tournament Fighters for the NES is more of a historical oddity than a competitive fighter. It's one of the most technically ambitious NES fighting games, but its clunky mechanics, limited roster, and balance issues keep it from achieving greatness. Still, for fans of the Turtles or those fascinated by late-era NES experiments, it's worth checking out, if only to see what happens when Konami tried to bring Street Fighter to an 8-bit sewer. The Jungle Book. The Jungle Book on the NES, released in 1994, is part of the wave of Disney licensed platformers that flooded the gaming market in the early 90s. Developed by Virgin Interactive and published by Virgin Games, it arrived surprisingly late in the NES lifecycle, long after most developers had moved on to the Super Nintendo and the Super Mega Drive. The Super Mega Drive, what am I on about? I was going to say something else there, but no, we'll go with Super Mega Drive because why not? While the 16-bit versions of the Jungle Book are often fondly remembered for their animation and musical charm, the NES version is a scaled-down, less polished experience. Though not without its merits, it falls short of the magic and craftsmanship seen in its more powerful counterparts. Based on the 1967 animated film, the game loosely follows the adventures of Mowgli, a boy raised in the jungle by wolves as he journeys through the wilderness towards the man village. Along the way, he must battle wildfire, avoid hazards, and face iconic characters like Kaa, King Louie, and Shere Khan. The NES version retains a basic narrative beat to the movie, but storytelling is minimal and primarily delivered through brief text scenes between levels. If you're not already familiar with the film, the game offers very little context, relying heavily on players' prior knowledge of Disney's classic. Gameplay is a straightforward platforming affair. Mowgli can jump, climb, and attack enemies by throwing bananas, boomerangs, or other projectiles he picks up. The controls are responsive for the most part, but Mowgli's jump arc feels a bit stiff, and his hitbox can be frustratingly large, leading to many cheap deaths from enemies or environmental hazards. Enemy placement is often unforgiving, and platforming segments can become frustrating due to awkward level design and occasional collision detection issues. Each stage is themed after a different part of the jungle, including treetop canopies, waterfalls, ruins, and temples. The goal is typically to collect a certain number of gems or other items before the exit opens. This collectathon mechanic can slow the pacing to a crawl, forcing players to scour every inch of the level. Unlike other linear platformers, the Jungle Book on the NES often feels like a scavenger hunt, which may appeal to some players but frustrate others who prefer more straightforward action. Graphically, the NES is a mixed bag. While the character sprites are recognisable and carry some of the film's charm, the backgrounds are sparse and repetitive. Mowgli is decently animated, but many enemies are recycled and lack variety. Compared to the lush visuals of the Super Mega Drive, Did It Again, and the Super Nintendo, this iteration feels bare bones. I'm not editing it, by the way, you can just have it and laugh at me for it. Still, for an NES game released in 1984, it's serviceable and shows that developers did try and push the aging hardware. The music is cheerful and lively, with chiptune renditions of songs inspired by the film's soundtrack. While the NES couldn't replicate the full orchestration of Disney's musical numbers, the themes are catchy and help give the game some much-needed personality. The sound effects, however, are very generic. Enemy hits and item pickups all produce the same tiny beeps, which grow repetitive quickly. One major flaw of the game is its uneven difficulty. The early levels are manageable, but the difficulty spikes dramatically in later stages. Enemy patterns become more erratic, and the platforming challenges are more punishing. Combined with limited continues and unforgiving level design, it becomes a slog near the end. This difficulty isn't due to clever design, but rather than cheap traps and poor enemy placement, which feels like artificial padding to extend the game's length. Critically, the Jungle Book on the NES was met with lukewarm response. Reviewers at the time acknowledged its decent graphics and sound, but criticised its frustrating gameplay and repetitiveness. In modern retrospectives, it's often overshadowed by 16-bit versions, which are far more polished and enjoyable. In conclusion, the Jungle Book for the NES is a competent but unremarkable platformer. It captures some of the spirit of the Disney film, but its clunky design, repetitive gameplay, and harsh difficulty prevent it from standing out. As one of the last licensed games on the NES, it's more of a curiosity for collectors than a must-play adventure. Zoda's Revenge: Star Tropics 2. Zoda's Revenge: Star Tropics 2, released in 1994, is one of the final first-party titles developed by the NES and serves as a direct sequel to the 1990 cult hit Star Tropics. Created by Nintendo's R&D 3 division and exclusively released in North America, the game once again follows teenage baseball hero Mike Jones as he embarks on a time-traveling adventure to stop the evil alien Zoda. While Zoda's Revenge expands on many of the ideas in the original game, it also streamlines others, resulting in an experience that feels far more polished in some areas, but arguably less ambitious overall. Despite being overlooked due to its late release and lack of a Japanese counterpart, Zoda's Revenge remains a charming, quirky adventure that closes out the NES with style. The story picks up after the events of the first game. Mike discovers the Oxford Wonderworld book, a mystical tomb that sends him hurtling through different periods in history in search of the missing tetrads, powerful blocks, clearly inspired by Tetris, tied to an ancient alien civilization. Throughout his journey, Mike meets historical and fictional figures like Sherlock Holmes, Cleopatra, King Arthur, and Leonardo da Vinci. The tone is light-hearted, mixing historical settings with sci-fi elements and Nintendo's signature oddball humour. The narrative gives the game a unique flavour, constantly shifting settings and introducing new eccentric characters. Gameplay still consists of two primary modes, top-down exploration and grid-based dungeon crawling. In towns and story segments, Mike talks to NPCs and solves like puzzles, while dungeons involve combat, time jumps and item usage. The overworld is no longer a separate screen navigated by map. Instead, transitions between time periods and locations are more seamless. This change makes the game feel more fluid, but also removes the overworld's old-school charm and structure from the first Star Tropics. Combat has seen some improvements. Mike's movement in battle now allows for diagonal directions, a huge upgrade from the rigid four-way movements from the first game. The single change dramatically improves responsiveness and flow during dungeon sequences. Mike's primary weapon is once again a projectile-based attack. This time beginning with a psychic attack rather than a yo-yo, he then gains additional weapons such as axes, shurikens and psychic bolts as the game progresses. These upgrades come and go depending on the chapter, which adds variety but also limits player control about how they tackle enemies. Dungeon design is a mixed bag. Some are cleverly crafted with interesting puzzles, while others feel padded or derivative. The increased movement options make platforming sections less frustrating, but hit detection remains slightly inconsistent, and the difficulty curve can spike unexpectedly. Boss fights are more imaginative this time, often requiring pattern recognition and reflexes rather than brute force. However, enemy variety is lacking, with some enemies recycled throughout multiple chapters. Visually, Zoda's Revenge is impressive by NES standards. The environments are colourful and diverse, reflecting each historical time period with distinct artistic touches. The character sprites are expressive and larger in many NES RPGs, giving each location its own identity. Background details in dungeons and towns are more refined than the original game, and the overall polish speaks to the developer's experience with the aging hardware. The music retains the catchy, upbeat feel of the first game, with themes that adapt to the time period Michael's visiting. While it lacks the rich instrumentation of the 16-bit titles, the soundtrack is memorable and well suited to the action. Sound effects are typical NES fare, punchy, functional, but not essentially noteworthy. Reception for Zoda's Revenge was modest. It didn't receive the same level of exposure as its predecessor and lacked the Nintendo power backing, making the original a cult classic. The shift in tone, simplification of mechanics, and loss of the first game's mysterious island-hopping vibe left some fans disappointed. Still, it earned a small but loyal following over the years. In conclusion, Zoda's Revenge Star Tropics 2 is an underrated and ambitious NES title that blends time travel storytelling with classic Zelda-style gameplay. It improves on its predecessor's controls and expands the world in fun ways, even if it sacrifices some of the original's charm. As one of the final first-party NES games, it stands as a reminder of what the console is capable of, even at the end of its life. And finally, Lion King. Yes, Lion King. The Lion King for the NES is a curious and little-known adaptation of Disney's 1994 animated blockbuster. Unlike the acclaimed version on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive, didn't do it that time, which were developed by Westwood Studios and praised for their visuals and challenge, the NES version was developed by a different team, Bit Managers, and released only in select regions. In fact, this NES port never saw release in North America. It came out primarily in Europe and parts of South America, making it one of the most obscure Disney-licensed NES titles. While its attempt to replicate the iconic story and gameplay of its 16-bit siblings, The Lion King on the NES is a compromised and often frustrating experience, hampered by the hardware limitations and uneven design. The game follows the broad strokes of the film's plot. You play as Simba, first as a playful cub and later as a mature lion, on a quest to reclaim the Pride Lands from the villainous Scar. Key moments from the movie, like the wildebeest stampede, Hakuna Matata, and the final battle on Pride Rock, are loosely adapted across a series of side-scrolling platforming levels. However, the storytelling is extremely minimal. Short static cutscenes introduce major plot points, but they lack the cinematic flair or emotional weight of the source material. For anyone unfamiliar with the film, their game really offers nothing here. Gameplay is a traditional 2D platformer, but far less refined than the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive versions. Simba's control is stiff with floaty jumps, delayed attacks, and frustrating hit detection. As a cub, Simba attacks by leaping onto enemies and yelping, though the yelp has little range and often fails to register a hit. As an adult, he gains claw swipes, which should feel more empowering, but is underwhelming due to the clunky animation and limited responsiveness. The platforming is often imprecise, with Simba slipping off edges or getting caught in awkward collisions. Combined with a limited health bar and a sparse checkpoint system, the game can quickly become aggravating. Level design is a mixture of creative concepts and maddening execution. Stages like the Elephant Graveyard or the Wildebeest Stampede try to mirror iconic film scenes but are hampered by technical constraints. Platforms are small and poorly spaced, enemy placement is often unfair, and the scrolling can cause enemy or hazards to appear with little warning. The game frequently relies on trial and error rather than skill, and younger players, the intended audience, would likely find themselves stuck early on. Precision platforming mixed with unpredictable enemy behaviour makes for a difficult and often unrewarding experience, also like the original. Visually, The Lion King on the NES tries admirably to capture the aesthetic of the film, but the results are really mixed. Character sprites are small but recognisable, Simba is clearly Simba, and the key elements resemble their movie counterparts. Backgrounds are colourful but lack the depth, with flat, repetitive patterns and minimal animation. For an NES game, it's decent, but compared to the lush detail of the 16-bit versions, it's extremely watered down. There's also notable sprite flicker and slowdown during busy scenes, which further hinders playability. The music, composed in chiptune form, often samples renditions of the film's soundtrack, including I Just Can't Wait to Be King and Hakuna Matata. While the melodies are recognisable, they're stripped down and looped endlessly, growing repetitive over time. The sound effects are basic, with generic jumps, hits, and enemy grunts doing little to enhance the atmosphere. The audio design kinda just does the job, but just doesn't really have that inspiration that we want. Critical reception for the NES was sparse, giving its limited release, but retrospective reviews are often harsh. Players know its poor controls, frustrating design, lack of polish. It's frequently viewed as a curiosity, something that my collectors may see out because you've probably never seen the thing, but few would actually have that recommended as a worthy adaptation of the film. In the end, The Lion King on the NES is a pale imitation of its 16-bit counterparts. While it tries to bring Disney's timeless story to 8-bit life, it's ultimately a clumsy and underwhelming effort. For fans of the film or the NES collectors, it's a novelty at best. For everyone else, this King's Roar is more of a whimper. And that's it. 7 late-era NES games. What do you think of this list? Are the ones I need to talk about? Have you ever played any of these? Especially the NES Lion King version. I bet none of you have actually played that unless you emulated it or you live in Europe. But until then, I'll see you all again in another 3 days for another video. My name's been Danny. Chase your dreams. Bye bye.